So this time we're here in Monahans, Texas, and you're looking at the Million Barrel Museum. What is this, you ask? The Million Barrel Museum? Interesting story about this thing. So back in the 20s, West Texas here had a pretty big oil boom, as you might be aware from your history books. And in the late 20s, Shell Oil had what they thought was a really neat idea. Since they were running out of barrels to store their oil, they thought they would create one giant barrel of oil. So they dug this pit here in the West Texas plains, and it was designed to hold 5 million barrels of oil. 5 million, think about that. So they dug this pit, and then they packed down the ground and then lined it with hard packed sand. And then on top of that, they poured concrete on the bottom, and then they poured concrete on the side there. And on top of it, they built a wooden dome of timber so that the oil would be protected from all the elements and stuff. And in 1928, they started pumping the oil in. Well, guess what? Once they got to about 1 million barrels of oil in here, they realized they had a problem. The concrete was not enough to hold all those millions of pounds of oil. And so the concrete quickly cracked, and the oil just started seeping back into the ground. And so that was the quick lifespan of the million barrel pit. And so here the pit stood, abandoned and unused for the better part of 30 years. Then a guy came along, and he thought, aha, I've got a great idea for this pit. So he bought the pit, and he filled up all the cracks in the cement, and he started filling it with water. And his idea was that this was going to be a nice, great boating lake for a nice, great lake for boating, swimming, all that kind of stuff. And the lake opened on October 6th, 1958, and it closed on October 7th, 1958. And guess why? This guy had the same problem that Shell Oil Company had. This thing could not hold the weight of the water, and it started sinking. So that was 1958. So here the thing left vacant again for many, many years. And then finally, I believe it was in maybe the 80s or so, Ward County, which is a county here, thought it would be a good place to use for parties, tailgate parties, community events, things like that. So they took control of it, and for a good number of years they've been using it for different events. And you can see right here they've put in a bandstand and all that kind of stuff. But then subsequently, look what else they did here. They moved a couple old houses here, old historical houses, one right there, one over there, and then some other equipment, a couple of train cars right here, an old fire truck, and then they built this Rattlesnake Bomber Base. And so the Rattlesnake Bomber Base is a nickname for the old Peyote Air Force Base that was here in World War II. Let's go in. Peyote Air Force Base was built in 1940 to be a training base for B-17 bombers. And it's really actually an interesting history of how the 19th Bomb Group got here to be the training group. So when things were starting to heat up back in the late 30s, the 19th Bomb Group, which consisted of B-17 airplanes, was over at Clark Air Force Base, or they call it Clark Field then, in the Philippines. When Pearl Harbor happened, then the crews got in their airplanes and took off, and then the Japanese eventually bombed Clark Base, but they didn't get the airplanes. And so the B-17s were then relegated to, instead of combat, they were relegated to getting people out of the Philippines so they don't get overrun by the Japanese. At the same time, the U.S. government started building Peyote Air Force Base, as well as a bunch of different airfields here in West Texas, to start ramping up for what was going to be World War II for the United States. And so they brought the 19th Bomb Group over here from the Philippines to Peyote Air Force Base to become a training base for crews that were going to fly B-17s in the European theater as well as the Pacific theater. And the reason they brought the guys from the 19th Bomb Group is because they had combat experience now, and they thought that they would be a good resource for training new guys as they're going on to war. So it's a pretty nice little museum here, just showing everything about the Air Force Base and the bomb group, and has some personal effects of some of the guys, some letters, a little mock-up cross-section of B-17 and a waist gunner. So anyway, Peyote Air Force Base was built in 1940, and then it closed shortly after World War II, and then it reopened due to the starting quote-unquote Cold War with the Soviets. And then the base eventually turned into, was reopened in 1958. It eventually turned into a radar base because the threat of bombers coming over was pretty much gone because now of updated radar and because of the building of missiles. That was the new technology. So it became a radar base. But then in 1963, the base was once again closed and was closed for good. And so everything was torn down. The land reverted back to the University of Texas, and it's just pretty much laid fallow. The land gets leased out to ranchers for their cattle and all that. So if you ever get out to Monahans, Texas, it's in West Texas. It's west of Midland and Odessa. It's east of Pecos. Come on out and see the Million Barrel Museum. One of those things that it's kind of, you know, shoulder shrugging, but it's also one of those things that's pretty neat as well. Million Barrel Museum, Monahans, Texas. And I think that'll do it for this video. Let's see what the next adventure is going to bring. Yeah, it's a state park. Like I said, it's the smallest state park in Texas. How small do you ask? Well,